They are scolding me. Hello, everyone.
Hola a todos.
It is a real pleasure for me to be visiting the Centenary institution founded by Carlos Pellegrini.
Fundada por Carlos Pellegrini.
That storm pilot who took over in the middle of a crisis did what he had to do without worrying about the political consequences and saved the public accounts of our country to return to the end of the 19th century to the path of growth that we had become accustomed to. Since the moment I got involved in the presidential race, I have always been a guide for Carlos Pellegrini.
La carrera presidencial, siempre puse como guía a Carlos Pellegrini.
In fact, when we launched the movement for freedom, it was when Carlos Pellegrini took over as president in the middle of a crisis.
De la libertad avanza en lo que fue nuestra carrera hacia la banca de diputados. Fue cuando justamente asumía el doctor Carlos Pellegrini como presidente en el medio de una crisis.
That day we said that the process of national reconstruction began, which was the moment in which we were going to start taking the first steps to return to Argentina.
Íbamos a empezar a dar los primeros pasos para volver a la Argentina grande nuevamente.
It was always an inspiration because Pellegrini did what he had to do.
Una inspiración porque Pellegrini hizo lo que había que hacer.
At that time, it was much more complicated because the times in which the information traveled made things that had to be done pay high costs.
Los tiempos a los cuales viajaba la información hacía que hacer las cosas que había que hacer se pagaran costos más altos.
I remember that when Pellegrini left office, he decided to leave for the Congress. He lived a few blocks from the Congress.
Pellegrini deja el cargo, decide salir por el Congreso, vivía a pocas cuadras del Congreso.
And one of his assistants told him, "Don Carlos, don't go out here because there are people who are angry." Pellegrini decided to adjust his jacket, put on his coat, took the cane and went out walking where he had to go out walking.
Ajustarse su chaqueta, se pone la galera, toma el bastón y sale caminando por donde tenía que salir caminando.
And obviously in those meters they did not tell him very nice things, however history remembers him as a pilot of storms.
Sin embargo, la historia lo recuerda como el piloto de tormentas. Entonces,
this means that we come to do what we have to do regardless of what is said in the short term.
Independientemente de las cosas que se digan en el corto plazo.
Fortunately for us, luck is bringing us better results even in the short time.
Trayendo mejores resultados aún de corto plazo.
We have managed to make the biggest fiscal adjustment in the history of humanity in time and form. Because if we consider the adjustment between the National Treasury, which is a reduction in public spending of 30%, there are no records of such adjustment in the period, let's say, except that there are 24 cases in the history of the world. But in the other 23 after a war, therefore there is no record of something like that. And also the adjustment of the central bank, which was 10 points of the PBI, the deficit. In a year, basically in 6 months, we made that adjustment of 15 points of the PBI. In addition, the Treasury, where everyone said it was impossible to do it, we did it in a month. So that everyone predicted that not only we were not going to be able to lower inflation, but to be traveling at interannual levels of 300, today it travels at levels of 20. But they also predicted a mega hyper-recession. And when we look at the monthly estimate of economic activity, In times of destationing, when we compared December 24 with December 23, not only have we not fallen, but also the PBI rose 6%. The first quarter traveled at levels of 5-8, and now the PBI has been traveling the second quarter at levels of 7-7. They also said that we were going to exploit the number of poor. One way assumes the number sincerely, and obviously that meant knowing that poverty was around 57% and today it is around 31%. That is to say that the heartless and heartless liberals took 12 million human beings out of poverty, and within those 12 million human beings that we take out, there are 2.5 million young people and children who live poverty. While the City of Freedom is working, but well, it seems that for the status quo everything is wrong. But we are going to continue to be neighbors and continuing to make Argentina great again. In short, it is in honor of the founder of this club that I would like to take the opportunity to bring to the coalition a discussion that we have had in recent weeks about whether Argentina was powerful or not between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. To put it in context, at that time our country was among the first 5 countries with the highest per capita GDP in the world, Font Angus Madison. It is true that later they were doing recalibrations of this estimate. So Argentina is not first, it is third, but we basically are there. We reach a total gross domestic product superior to the sum of Brazil, Mexico, Paraguay and Peru together, and we got to have an even higher per capita GDP than that of the United States. Although we were a young country, our population was growing at steady pace. Between 1870 and 1914, our population practically quadrupled, and our nation was a refuge for millions of people escaping hunger and war. Those looking for better living conditions concluded that Argentina had everything it needed to prosper. During this process, we also developed a large part of the infrastructure that we still utilize to this day. In fact, we were the country of the region with the most kilometers of tramways. During that same period, we managed to pass from 80% of illiteracy to eradicate it. And we managed to improve our life expectancy by 50%. Buenos Aires quickly became the first cosmopolitan capital of Latin America, and Argentina became the protagonist and the concert of the nations. We were referenced in international law, we mediate in international conflicts, and our public titles were demanded in the main banks of Europe and the United States. And if that were not enough, we still had vast virgin lands and resources to be exported. Just like now, that is, 100 years ago, we had the same gold, the same oil, the same copper and the same fertile fields as today. And why did this happen in this way? Because we were embraced by an elementary truth, that having a child was the best thing to have a thriving civil society. Imagine that it was estimated that by the time the participation of public spending on PBI was around 10%. And in recent years it became close to 45% on PBI, a true aberration that we have begun to correct and that is now at 35%. In fact, the latest data on what has to do with the participation of the national public sector is at the lowest level since 2007. We have made a tremendous adjustment. An adjustment that is not accompanied by the provinces or by the municipalities that continue to maintain the same levels in terms of PBI since the moment we assumed. That is, there has been a motorway in the nation and it is not being accompanied by the provinces or by the municipalities. And it is more so in some cases, some perverse, in the face of the taxes that we make, because we also have to cut it. Last year we eliminated taxes by more than 2 points of PBI. Some provinces take advantage of those losses that we make at the national level, to raise taxes at the provincial level or at the municipal level. That period was not only highlighted for having a thriving civil society, but also especially for having a social and economic elite at the height of the time. That was the spearhead of national growth. In the distance, both Pellegrini and the Jockey Club are a clear example of what I say. However, this virtuous path of growth stopped when the model of freedom was replaced by the model of the present state, a model that did nothing but put the car in front of the horse, draining our society of resources in the economic, while in the cultural it was proposed to replace private initiative men for the state initiative and failed miserably. This led to the creation of the famous caste, which were the ones that year after year tried to replace society for the state. Where before we had dreamer elites who invested in risks to create innovative solutions, knowing that they could have the fruit of their work, we went to have friends of power entangled in commercial models, depending on coercion and their houses. Where before we had a culture of effort in which study and work were protagonists, we went to have a culture of despair where the school standards were systematically lowered to the point of cancelling the repetition, and where the word work was distorted in going to warm a chair to the municipality. Where before we had a high class capable of philanthropic works without precedent, we went to have a state incapable of buying a tomography, and thus we can continue to enumerate for days. In fact, there is a wonderful book of our highest reference and the history of the ideas of freedom, which is Dr. Alberto Venegas, along with another giant of the ideas of freedom, which is Martin Cross, who has a wonderful book called In Defense of the Most Necessary. And one of the things that it shows is how society was self-organized to give contention to the most vulnerable, which clearly, when that help was replaced by the state, it obviously led to clientelism, and his professor Huerta de Soto is usually denied. The help to the poor generates the poorest. That is to say, when the state does this, instead of contributing to get them out of that situation, they sink them in that situation. That is why one of our policies focused on growth, and from the first moment was the policy of human capital. That is, we have a macro strategy that is built on the idea of fiscal balance, the fixed amount of money, and the flexible type of change. Let's say something that we did by getting out of the sepulchre, and basically that was done prior to healing the balance of the central bank. And on the other hand, a clear growth strategy that has to deal with reinsertion in the world, with economic freedom, with deregulation, and obviously with human capital. And in that sense, what changed was philosophy. Before, social policy sought, let's say, to give assistance, to give subsidies. That does not work. It is not a matter of giving fish to people. It is a matter of teaching them to fish. And that is what we are doing from human capital. And with that logic, we have taken out 12 million people from poverty. And we are at levels, let's say, that had not been seen in Argentina for a long time, but returning dignity to people, something that clearly many governments have not wanted. Obviously, as a consequence of that defeatist mentality, today the political discourse is popular. The denial, which we were once important, is that it is precisely basically denying that golden Argentina, that wonderful Argentina, is also a way of denying the strenuous failure of the statist model. In fact, there is an economist named Federico Domings He wrote a very interesting book where he separates Argentina and long cycles. Instead of looking at short cycles, he looks at cycles of around 80, 90, 100 years. And basically there is a moment called the Liberal Argentina, which is 90 years between 1853. That is the moment of the constitutional liberty, and let's say 1943. And he says that at that moment, it is the moment where Argentina clearly made the takeoff. And Argentina it stopped being the country of barbarians. It became a power. Clearly, the story is a story that makes it very uncomfortable for miserable pigs who want to deny the decline that began from 1943 and ended up collapsing in 2003. Why not forget that we were on the brink of hyperinflation? We had passes remunerated in a central bank, the equivalent of 4 monetary bases. We had debt in pesos winning, let's say in a course of 3 months, for the equivalent of 9 monetary bases. That is, we would have multiplied in less than 3 months the amount of money by 14. And we also had a mania bar, let's say a surplus of money, which was double what we had in the previous Al Rodriguez. Remember that in Al Rodriguez, inflation multiplied by 6. Therefore, if we had the double, let's say we could multiply by 12, then multiply by 12 as a drop in the demand for money, multiply by 14 for expansion of the supply. Clearly, in fact, Ariel Kornberg himself made the alternative calculation, and the one that gave me 17,000, he gives him 18,000. So basically that was what we faced. And we have managed to tame inflation without expropriations. That is, we have respected the right of ownership. All the cleaning that was done of the balance, the central bank, we did not make a Bionics plan. We cleaned it and the market. We did it respecting the right of ownership, something that will basically be in all the books of tax. From the history of such a task done, let's say not only by the enormous Minister of Economy that I have, who is Toto Capito, is vice, let's say Jose Dosa, let's say, but also because of the joint work between the Central Bank of Santiago Borsali and Pablo Cornes from Finances. In addition, we did it without price controls. We did it without fixing the type of change. And we did it in an honest way. Because it is not that we made the adjustment of rates before and after starting to measure the stabilization program, but we are doing it during. In fact, if you, for example, take the latest data of minor inflation of 1.6, if you look closely, it is already coming to 0.8. That is to say that today inflation is already low, let's say it travels around 12%. And if you look at the issue of free baskets, let's say, of what has to do with the basket that determines poverty, we are at inflation levels around 7–8%, which is missing a lot, without a doubt, because I am not going to rest until inflation is 0. But what we did a lot is also true. So imagine that that model would have left us not only hyperinflation, it would have left us at least 90% of the poor. And they want to cover that. They want to deny the greatness that we had during the 19th century and early 20th century. It is a way of fighting the enormous failure, especially when they do it through garbage, with a historian title that what they want to do is hide the failure of the ideology that they hide. And that is why I force the data. That is why I say they always believe that they have the right to rewrite history. But we tell them, we answer them, As Mises said, while they continue to repeat their own lies, we are going to continue repeating our truths. And also the problem does not happen simply because it is a lie, constantly repeated to erase our memory. But the problem happens because it is a sad passion that intends to paralyze society to convince it that we can now achieve great things, as if our country was condemned to do little for the rest of time because doing nothing, even when it is believed that we can do little. It is the worst of the decisions. Many times, even the criticism, if we were actually a power or not, is given by people who at the same time oppose the exploitation of our resources under labels such as Scipio or Vendipatria. The only possible conclusion of this is that in reality they are not really interested in whether we were powerful or not, but they are interested in us never being. That is why they focus their efforts on discussing the etymology of the word power instead of accompanying us in the discussion of how to return to being one of the 5 most powerful economies in the world. This seems to be a superficial discussion of social networks, but it is not. It is a discussion about the Argentine soul. And today, more than ever, it is especially important that we defend this epic legacy. Why? Because as a country we are going through a bisagra moment in our history. We are returning to the model of freedom, the model of abundance and the generation of wealth. And we are leaving aside the mentality of scarcity and redistribution that so much damage has done to this beautiful nation. That is why it is time to meet again with the spirit that characterizes Carlos Pellegrini, because it is time for society and especially the elites to regain the courage to dream. That is why I cannot think of a better place than this to mention these issues, because it is time to be the spearhead of this new country. Now that it is time to take risks, invest, and create, like our grandparents and great-grandparents. You are the ones in charge of carrying the torch that was given to you. You are the ones who have the capital, the time, the contacts, and the knowledge to begin to rebuild Argentina. If we did not dream on our own with a prosperous Argentina, the bad guys are going to dream on our own. They only dream of nightmares of misery and suggestion, which is what we have been accustomed to for the last 100 years. In short, may God bless the Argentines. May the forces of heaven be with us, and long life freedom. Thank you very much.